And one thing that kind of like surprised me a lot to hear is that it's quite common actually in many countries to have retouched and beautified images into passports.
Yeah, funk it up, listen close to the knowledge that we're about to dose. Face matters, ain't no joke. It's the podcast with a biometric poke.
Welcome to another episode of the podcast Face Matters, a podcast about biometrics, identity, and the prevention of fraud. And today our guest is Philipp Srock, and you work with beautification, is it?
Yes, I've worked on beautification, and not beautification itself, but rather image manipulation detection, where beautification comes into place as something we want to detect, of course.
Mm-hmm. And we have Brage Strand, as usual, from Mobile.
Yeah, being a biometrics nerd.
Biometrics nerd.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about the things you're doing.
Yeah, perhaps do a quick intro on yourself
There's a very big variety of image manipulation techniques. Some of them we're discussing today, like retouching, where there's a beautification applied on some image and some kind of general improvement on the image. And then there's different others, like more trendiness, I would say, like we could touch on later a little bit, on deepfakes, for example, and AI-based manipulation on them. But also I think maybe some of the listeners will be familiar with morphing attacks, which is also some kind of image manipulation. And this all is where we have an image which is just changed. And now for retouching, to elaborate on this a bit further, retouching is done to enhance beauty of face images, or the face image is what we're interested in as biometric researchers, of course.
And when you say kind of like enhance beauty, do you have any examples?
So this is also a very wide variety within retouching itself, where we have different kinds of facial manipulations, such as enlarging the eyes, removing skin wrinkles and textures, enlarging the mouth, changing the light on the image, like how brightness on the image, seeing how the image is portrayed to the viewer, and then this can be on the whole image, but this can also be just on parts of the image, which is a challenge because in the end, when we're trying to detect it, we don't know what manipulation there is done on the image, of course, and what attack technique kind of is used.
So it could be kind of like many different ways of doing this manipulation, and depending on what you want to detect, or some might be easy to detect, some might be hard.
I think the main issues that we need to detect a whole variety. There's not just one we need to detect, but we need to detect all of them. If we would, for example, use our system and build it to perfectly detect only very small changes, and now we feed it an image where there's just a full filter on the whole image, and the whole image is just brightened up, for example, we would have very hard times to detect it. Same goes vice versa, of course. So we need, then when we try to detect it with AI in our training set, some very variety of training.
Yeah. And then you said filters, right? So one example of such a manipulation is me adding a filter on Instagram or Snapchat, something like that, right?
Yes, this is some kind of manipulation, of course. Like Instagram and Snapchat and other social media, they have it built into their system, so they know that people want to use it, and people using it frequently all the time, of course. So there's probably a lot of filters out there as well, which is not really good in terms of social impact, of course. When people try to compare themselves with other people on the internet that have filters applied and just are natural, don't portray the reality. That's kind of what it is. But also, of course, in the sense of biometric recognition on these images, which makes it just harder. For example, there has been previous research that suggested exactly this, that if images have been retouched, then face recognition is very hard to has higher error rates on face recognition systems if we put in retouched images. So the impact is clearly there, and therefore we need to detect it.
And then you were kind of like touching about some of the problems, right? Why do we care about facial retouching or beautification, right? So you mentioned kind of like the broader societal, okay, I'm comparing myself to someone that is not real, right? So that's one aspect of it. But and then you have it kind of like it actually impacts the accuracy of facial recognition. And one thing that kind of like surprised me a lot to hear is that it's quite common actually in many countries to have retouched and beautified images into passports. And what is the consequence of that, right, when you do stuff like that?
Yeah. To elaborate on this, the problem is that sometimes if we bring our image, like I would do back in Germany, bring our printed out image to the office and to the town hall and say, yeah, please give me a new passport. They take it and put it in. Then if you wanted to try it later on and to detect it, we just have higher error rates on this.
Yeah, and when you say detect there, then you mean facial comparison, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, facial comparison when we have, for example, in border controls. So we would now use our image that is retouched and compare it to ourselves, which we, of course, in reality not retouched. Then there's a higher difference because the characteristics in the image, like, for example, the eyes, the nose, or our skin texture has been altered or changed. And this can also happen without the user's knowledge. Photo studios, for example, when we take the images, they have interest, of course, in changing the image a little bit on making us more beautiful so that we would go there again. It's, of course, very understandable. And this might happen without our knowledge, and of course, and we have no way to say afterwards, okay, now we have a unchanged image, unaltered image, when there's no live enrollment.
Yeah. And from, say, a border guard's point of view, you want as raw image as possible, right? You don't want any alteration. You want a real image happening right now when you cross a border machine or in front of a border guard compared to a non-altered image. That's kind of like the best you get,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But our cell phones also have AI built into them, and the cameras on the cell phones use AI. Does that impact the biometrics?
So I guess it may, and we, when we kind of like build the biometric system on our SDK, we do as much as we can to kind of like actually influence these systems in ways that we want to and understand how they work. So let's say you had a implicit filter that changed the jawline or for all the users, then that would influence the accuracy of the comparison, basically. And I think that's quite, I think also increasingly it's more and more advanced in these client-side devices, so more and more things are happening there, which is actually more and more important for us to account for and try to understand, so that Google or as in a Pixel phone or Apple doesn't do anything to kind of like mess up the flow that for us really. And then I guess in addition we work a lot with kind of like KYC, know your customer, and onboarding, and there we have the same issue, right? It's not really a border guard, but it's someone that sits in a bank and say, is this the real person that is onboarding? And then that's, of course, harder if the image are being retouched.
Yeah, especially if we can't verify this by person. For example, we do this only digitally. Yeah. We have to take some digital photo. And if this digital photo has then been altered, the face recognition in the system itself would have more problems to detect it.
Yeah. And I know we have been doing some earlier projects that I haven't talked to you about, but that we worked a bit with some government agencies in Norway, working on detecting deepfakes for marketing purposes, because there's a legislation in Norway on that you should mark retouched images, right?
Yes.
And which is really hard for the government to actually enforce. But because how do you know, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is very interesting because this doesn't apply only to Norway, but this also applies, for example, to Spain and UK and some of the other countries. They have also some, they call it guidelines on it.
Yeah.
think Sweden and Denmark, don't quote me on this, but I think they have it as well. And if this, because they see the issue that if the marketing is just so distorted from reality, that this poses an issue for the society and, for example, mental health in the end, which of course wasn't the intention of the people that marketed, but still this is what it results into in the end. Yeah.
Do you know, by the way, if it's a completely synthetic face, if you have to market then as well? Because then it's all is.
I don't know, unfortunately, no, but I would assume.
I need to check up. It might be also under the AI Act to mark those kind of use cases. At least kind of like be able to attest it that it's okay, so now we talked about many different retouching, right? Okay, so we have this, I'm getting it into my passport, or it's a photoshopped image on my X profile or Instagram profile, right? Yeah. What have you kind of like worked on regarding detection of these types of images? Are you working on some specific detection or some specific manipulation, some specific context? What's your kind of like work on that?
Yeah. Although detection of, for example, social media images and so-called in the wild images would be very interesting for forensic purposes, for example.
Yeah.
This is not our research focus in that regard. So we focused only on ICAO compliant images, which are the images that are used in passports. So
yeah, so ICAO is kind of like the UN travel collaboration, and then you have a set of standards, right? Basically say, okay, an image should look like that. You should look full frontal to the camera.
Yes. For example, like this, not wearing too many headbands or caps, having a good brightness on all your image, having general high quality in your image, having a good enough resolution, for example, as well. Yeah.
By the way, how does do you know how the beautification influence the face quality metrics? That's the kind of like standards where you measure if this is a good AKI compliant image or not?
Yes. So depends. We looked into it when we looked into it when we looked at how we measure quality for face recognition. So that's the term that we have to use there. We can't measure like general quality, but quality for face recognition. And we said that, okay, this will probably be very likely still the general quality of the image. And there, the quality declines when you have something retouched.
And you actually see it in the face quality metrics as well, that it's decline, or?
Yeah, it's a slight decline, yeah.
I was curious because I guess a lot of this filter really doesn't necessarily change the light distribution. It doesn't necessarily change the way you look at the camera. So it might still be a quite high quality image for facial recognition, just not for the right person anymore, right?
I'd assume that this is because when we change some of the face, for example, removing wrinkles, we also lose some detail on the face, which then would be used later on in the face recognition system to do the face recognition. And when we just remove all the wrinkles and like little parts that are making our face, then it's harder to detect.
Yeah, makes sense. So then you're primarily working on facial full frontal images. Okay, what kind of filters have you experimented with? What kind of methods do you see? Do you see anything working? Was it something not really working at all, or?
So in our experiments, we used multiple filters as well, and they were different kinds of filters. There were filters that changed a large portion of the image. There were filters that changed only very slight details on the image, that even for humans would be very, very hard to detect. If you just compare images side by side, you would see, okay, this is a very slight change. But if you look only on the image, then like in a single image comparison, then this becomes way harder. And what we explained earlier, we only, of course, have one image when we need to detect it. So that's the first thing. And then secondly, when we use all the images in our data set, we don't use them all to train our models. and evaluate this, because we know from previous research that this concludes in really good results in the end. This is kind of a solved task, if you will, training AI models on the same filters and detecting them.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that the challenging is these unseen filters, really.
Yes, and this is unfortunately the reality, of course, because we have way more filters than we have data sets for. As a researcher, of course, I would like to have all filters in a really large data set, training extremely large models. But for reality, we have to just accept that there are filters out there we just don't know about.
Yeah. So you want to have a detection method that actually can generalize across a lot of different filters, really.
Yes, yes. And what we do for that is that we do a comparison where we train just on a subset of filters and then evaluate with the other filters and then swap around so that we know that we have filters testing which are not seen by the models before, which allows us exactly to doing that comparison I just said, like a real world kind of application on that.
Yeah. Cool. What type of are you kind of then looking at? Texture-based models? Do you look at kind of like pixel level? What do you kind of like use to detect? And do you try to build in some kind of explainability to kind of highlight things, or is it kind of like a black box answer?
Yeah, of course we need to work with explainability when we have AI all the way through. Although it's still very hard, and it wasn't my main focus on this research, but when we understand it better and try to explain what was changed, what do we see, then we can also improve this. The first naive approach would be to just use our general image, put it into our AI model, detect it, and then just see what comes out. And these detection rates are quite bad. Especially in these scenarios where we don't know the detect filter. So we can continue to work on this. For example, focus more on the face, cut out some of the outlining of the image, which is not that relevant, which still might be changed, keeping that in mind that we have some filters that change the whole image. And but focusing on the face itself, this, for example, helps to improve it. And then, as you said, there are also some pixel level analysis, and we can apply some filters to see where there has been pixel level change made, some pixel level artifacts in the image, which show to be higher when there's retouching done on the image. So we then know, okay, we have more artifacts, or not we, but the AI model we train knows that there are more artifacts, so this is more likely to be retouched, and it learns that. And then the same applies for frequency, which has been proven previously in morphing attacks, which we trust on very slightly in the beginning.
Yeah, and that's creating an image with the purpose of impersonating someone else. You merge faces.
Yes.
Into one single image that actually match to multiple identities. Yes,
there, of course, the attack being very clear to, also try to avoid or be an imposter for face recognition systems. And but in retouching, this also works. So we apply this different frequencies, and then we see that in the high frequencies there is a lot of change that made. In the low frequencies, there's not, or not that much. And this also makes sense since we, for example, just smoothen out some of the skin, and the skin is where the fine-grained details is where the frequencies are in our image.
Yeah.
And then we give this as well, again, to the AI model, and this then sees or learns to mostly look at the high frequencies and then see, okay, this is changed because this is different than what it is from the others. And as I talked about explainability, when we try to visualize this is also very clear for humans to see, okay, there is a lack of change in the high frequencies or there's not. And when it's kind of easy to see for humans, of course, depending on the image, and some of the examples are quite obvious also from the non-frequency-ized filters, but from the just filter detect for humans. And then the AI model can do this as well.
Yeah.
And even better, of course.
And then kind of like if you visualize our results, then it would be like I'm looking at the face image, and then I see here there is kind of like very smooth, or the pixel distribution is completely different because it's smoothed out with Photoshop, for instance.
Yes.
And then that's quite easy to highlight and actually understand from a human as well, right?
Yeah.
Cool. I'm kind of like reflecting on this because I think we work a lot on deepfake detection in general, and we primarily work with kind of like attackers that also wants to hide themselves, right? Let's say, especially when you do face morphing or when you do face swaps, try to present that into facial authentication system. Then you also actively try to find the models that it's hard to detect. But I'm guessing a lot of these use cases here, which is a problem for the government or the border control or say us in a KYC context, it's just a user wanting to look a bit better, right? So or a photographer just smoothing up something. So you might have some tools that's actually maybe easier to detect, or the tools itself isn't necessarily trying to hide. So and it's just someone adding or a bit thinner nose, a bit wider eyes, smoothing out some skins.
For example, when morphing attacked, there has been research conducted on what happens when you morph an image, print it out, and rescan it.
Yeah.
And this would, of course, be not an issue for retouching, since this is not the goal of retouching, to just avoid the detection.
You want what a good quality image of myself to present to others.
Yes.
But you know, I'm really curious how many kind of like document issuers around the world actually try to detect facial retouching, and if someone is like, okay, we don't care about it, and we just have it in our passports and identity cards, and then you have others with like, okay, this is a big problem, I care, I want as accurate as possible. Do you have any kind of like impression of that, on where kind of like from a research point of view, do you interact with kind of like government sources on that, or hear any rumors?
I don't interact with them myself. I like a little bit, depending on which one, but of course not with all in the world. There are just way too many. I think in the research sense of arguing that retouching poses a threat to recognition in border gateways, the general theme should be that there should be no retouching allowed in the passport. But going to every country in the world saying, please remove all your retouching and build some machines that can detect it and build all the processes and all the regulations and all around that comes with it is, of course, lots to ask and maybe not feasible.
And it's really expensive, right? It's the same with the face morphing. You really want to control the image into a passport. You don't want someone manipulating it to actually use it to impersonate someone else or avoid being detected. But
why would governments want to retouch passport photos?
I think it's more of we don't really focus on the problem. I think I would believe that's more of it. And then it may be, but it's different people making different decisions, right? So, okay, how would I make it easier for people to, I think some payment systems, for instance, where you do face payment. Then I think you actively add facial retouching in the payment process if you see yourself as well. And then if you are presented looking a bit better, then you have a better perception of the system. So I think you have example at least of payment system for facial where you actually actively do facial retouching as a way of driving retention, happiness, getting better feedback.
So it's marketing.
Yeah, you could say that, and then you can have it. Okay, I want to drive my customers in this passport issuing process, and I want to have them have a good experience. Okay, I'm adding slight retouching to give them a better experience of the process. So that might be a reason. Yeah, but from let's say you want to do a one-to-one or one-to-many facial recognition, then afterwards, then you for sure don't want it.
No, because it seems that it would be natural to have as little as possible when you want to recognize a face afterwards.
A question just came to my mind. I don't know the answer, but it might be interesting to investigate what happens when we put the same filter on the original image and before controlling it again. Yeah. Is this then easier to detect? Does it also change the error rate, or does it not change anything because the same filter is applied? I don't know.
I mean, maybe next time I need a new passport, they'll have CapCut in the police station, so I can like have a small, slimmer skin and.
Yeah, why not? Kind of like looking a bit ahead, what's kind of like the next step for kind of like your research focus? What do you think? Like Ståle is asking, why do we care, right? Do you have any kind of like? Do you think we should care more about facial retouching? What's about kind of like two questions, right? What practical? Yeah.
Retouching itself, although like it poses a threat we told about earlier, I think isn't the main image manipulation attack we have out there. I think deepfakes are way broader and pose also a way broader threat to our society.
Yeah.
As we have probably all seen some politicians that have faked videos being different rallies or just AI generated images, completely synthetic images that get better and better every day. And luckily there is a lot of research on it, but also the growth of these AI manipulation has been just enormous. In the last 3 years, there have been countries where in just 1 year it has been more than 4,000%. So more than just like a lot of times increase in these threat actors. And this also then impacts a society when looking at we as humans have to decide what is real and what is not. Then if an image is retouched or not, okay, we know it's made look a little bit different, but still it's the same person. For us as humans, at least, we can perceive that it's almost the same person. But if now we know that someone says something, or we don't know anymore if they say it or not, then this what becomes real is a really big threat, I think, for all of us in the future.
Totally. And that's a topic for a whole nother podcast.
At least, yeah.
Good. Do you have any last questions, Ståle, or should we wrap up with that?
No, I think I got the answers I needed.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's a niche area, but it's quite important for actually getting border control systems and the use of facial recognition to work, right? If you don't trust the reference, then you get lower quality.
Yeah, that's true.
Really good. Nice having you, Philipp.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great.
Yeah, and that's all for Face Matters for this episode, and we'll see you soon again.
Tune in now to Face Matters. Feel the